ועכשיו אני אעבור להצגת הדובר הראשון והמכובד שלנו, פרופסור אנדריאס פיקרס. Professor Andreas Fickers studied history, philosophy, and sociology, and is currently a professor for contemporary and digital history at the University of Luxembourg. He took his PhD in 2002 at RWTH Aachen University, I hope I pronounce it correctly, and worked as assistant professor for television history at Utrecht University and associate professor for comparative media history at Maastricht University. Professor Fickers leads many academic units. Since 2016, he is the director of the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, the third interdisciplinary center at the University of Luxembourg. He is also the head of its Digital History Lab and the head of the FNR funded doctoral training unit, Deep Data Science of Digital History, where he coordinates the traditional doctoral school. He is a principal investigator of several projects. Furthermore, he is the editor of the Journal of Digital History and co-editor of the book series Studies in Digital History and Hermeneutics, published by De Gruyter Oldenburg. We want to wholeheartedly thank you for honoring us with your presence at this conference, especially during these difficult times. Professor Fickers will talk about theory behind the study of digital archives and discuss living archives and the challenges of doing digital public history in real time, challenges that many of us face. Welcome, Professor Fickers. The floor is now yours.
Yeah, dear organizers, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a very great honor to be here today. I'm moved and I'm really glad to be here today. And I see it also as a kind of personal sign from my side to protest against what's going on in the world, also in many of the countries I've been around, and I'm very shocked and disappointed to see so many acts of anti-Semitism also happening in academia, and that's why for me it was clear from the very first moment when I got that invitation that I would like to come to join you and to support you in those difficult times. And please allow me especially to thank Beret and Ori, who really supported the traveling in whatever possible way. And I feel like a official state visitor here. So you took care of me so well. Thank you very much. We have become victims of our ever-increasing capacity to store, organize, instantly access, and share vast amounts of cultural data, says Simon Reynolds in his book Retromania. I quote, "Not only has there never been before a society so obsessed with the cultural artifacts of its immediate past, but there has never before been a society that is able to access the immediate past so easily and so copiously." According to Reynolds, rapid technological change generates feelings of nostalgia and has made the present as well as the past a foreign country. This observation is in line with findings of historians and cultural anthropologists such as François Hartog, Andreas or Aleida Assmann, who attest to a cultural time regime in our present that is characterized by an extended, even voracious simultaneity that pulls everything into its maw, to quote Hartog, and destroys not only the difference of times, but also historical consciousness. un présent monstre, says Hertog. At the same time, according to Aleida Assmann, this presentism is characterized by an unprecedented reactualization of the past, a new chronotopos, as she calls it, in which the approaches to the past have multiplied. And when wandering through the streets of Tel Aviv yesterday, I found this on the wall, and I think, oh, yeah, I'm at the right place for this talk. Media studies, as well as numerous authors from the field of digital humanities, hold the digital revolution and the big data turn responsible for the broad present, as Gumbrecht has called it. From this perspective, the culture of digitality is characterized by a socio-technical imagination that is dominated and determined by the idea of connectivity. According to Andrew Hoskins, one of the pioneers in the field of digital memory studies, the connective turn enables a previously unknown and privileged access to the past. I quote Hoskins, "The networked self and the society foster a view that collapses past and present into an orgy of hyperconnectivity, an impossible fantasy of prior generations with their now forgotten, closed, and contained media imaginaries." This assumption that the temporal regime of our time is characterized by an extended now as a new chronotopos has recently been challenged by historians like Helge Jortheim or Achim Landwehr, who have emphasized the pluritemporality of our current historical culture, which is exposed to multiple pasts converging into a highly debated and multivocal present. In a similar vein, Victoria Farreld has framed the historical present as polychronic. During history means engaging in a practice of regulating and relating different times in the present and addressing what she calls chronoschisms in a productive mode of historical interpretation. I quote Jortheim, rather than attributing historical moments and events to epochs and periods, temporal regimes or regimes of historicity, and making sweeping statements about historical shifts, Helge Jortheim writes, we could start analyzing the specific ways in which societies, from the very small to the very large, are out of sync with themselves and what they do to come to terms with their out of syncness. In this lecture, I would like to take inspiration of Jortheim's reflections on synchronicity and out of syncness, or as it has been introduced in the German tradition of philosophy since the 1920s, die Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, to think about current challenges of doing public history in times of real-time archiving. I will do so by starting with a more general reflection on what the digital, does to history as a professional academic practice, and how digitization at large and digital research tools and infrastructures in specific reframe our understandings and practices of documenting and archiving. For this purpose, I will take a closer look to the emergence and development of so-called living archives or memory banks, and how such initiatives can be understood as mediating interfaces between history and memory, between logics of preservation and logics of participation, and how they challenge classical approaches to contemporary history in terms of both political, epistemological, and ethical questions. But let's start with a rather simple question. What does the digital, do to history? In its directness and superficial simplicity, this question conceals a complexity whose ramifications continue to concern me to this day. Accordingly, what is presented in this lecture reflects a time and place-bound insight into a reflection process that is characterized by careful heuristic groping and feels obliged to the Serresian analogy, also from Michel Serres, the French philosopher, of the randonneur. Strike out sideways, débrouillez-vous, is Serres' advice in the chapter Method and Wandering in his famous book, The Five Senses, a Philosophy of Mingled Bodies. Indeed, approaching the digital as capital D feels like the exodus of Ulysses, described by Serres. That journey, characterized by deviations, fluctuations, and dispersions rather than Cartesian linearity. The semantics of the term randonnée, originating from the French courir à randon, which means to hunt for game and the reading of tracks, but in the English as random, retains the memory of the irregular, unforeseen escape route of the game, and thus of ambivalence that creeps over me, as that ambivalence that refers to the randomness of the route covered, expresses precisely the feeling of ambivalence that creeps over me when trying to grasp the multiple interferences of the digital in the practice of history. Grasping is meant here in the Caesarian sense of the double act of grasping. Grasping or comprehending reality becomes, as he says, a double act that involves gripping on it and comprehending reality in linguistic, theoretical terms and grasping it through efficiency, the intellectual and the technical form. It is precisely at this interface between theory and practice, conceptual penetration and methodological reflection of historical scholarship in the digital age that I want to situate my reflections here today. It is the tensions between a discipline deeply rooted in its 19th century methodological foundations and, on the other side, the radically changing knowledge economy of the 21st century that I think forces us to rethink and adapt central concepts, practices, and also claims towards how we produce evidence in our field. Digital research infrastructures, data sets, and tools now influence the way we think, we do, and we tell history. In short, how we produce historical meaning and try to interpret the past. This is why I think we need a digital update of our classical hermeneutics, aiming at a critical reflection on the multiple interferences of digital data, tools, and infrastructures in the doing of history today. And that is what we try to really focus on in Luxembourg at the center, at the C²DH, developing a kind of conceptual framework with this model of digital hermeneutics to grasp all these multiple interferences of the digital. In Everyone Their Own Historian, Ed Ayers, undoubtedly one of the pioneers of digital history, stresses that the digital turn has morphed our private histories and that the artificial memories that constitute history even more completely and to such a degree that boundaries between them blur and disappear, as everyone has become their own historian, their own curator, their own archivist and narrator. Ayers celebrates the multiplicity in the forms of history, I quote, because of our common bias of accountability to the historical record. But more importantly, he concludes his speech with a strong plea for a civic engagement of historians who should not be afraid to take our discipline to the world. I quote Ayers. So here's the situation. We are confronted with a new context for historical practice, and once more discouraging, terrifying, and promising that we've ever known. We can't afford to let history just happen to us. We have to make history. We cannot go back to simple ideas of fact and objectivity and authority. What we can do is to take our discipline out into the world, showing that the historical record matters, that some evidence is more trustworthy than other evidence, that context is necessary for any understanding of the past. Our profession will flourish by collaborating with everyone respectful of that evidence, with every teacher, every writer, every blogger, every podcaster, every filmmaker, every archivist, every interpreter of public history. By being an ally for everyone who explores, he was speaking here as the president of the American Historical Association, saying who explores American history for the greater good. This applies to everywhere. Ayers, who gave his talk in 2018 as then acting president of the American Historical Association, emphatically called on the responsibility of historians as civic actors based on their personal experiences and critical witnesses of their own times. Doing history, whether as professional, public, or private historian, means critical engagement with both the past and the present, and whatever means used for reaching that goal are fine. Historical research, of course, relies thoroughly on archives. For a considerable time, the notion of the archive, as well as that of historical scholarship, has been relatively stable, representing both a shelter of social practice exercised by those who guard what is deposited in those confines. Given the current digital transformation, the very notion of authority embedded within the notion of the archive has been fundamentally challenged. To quote Jacques Derrida, there is no political power without control of the archive, if not memory. Effective democratization can always be measured by its essential criterion, the participation in and the access to the archive, its constitution, and its interpretation. So if archiving is understood as the practice of selecting, of appraisal, the question of what is preserved and by whom is indeed as critical as the question of what story is told by whom based on this material. Omission and reduction have been a key strategy to keep the size of archives manageable, leading for a long time to an underrepresentation of, for example, women or other marginalized and vulnerable groups in traditional archives. The discourse on living archives, which currently focus very much on the inclusion and representation of marginalized groups, is, however, much older. As Luisa Passerini has shown, the notion can be traced to the early 1970s and was originally used in a much broader sense in social history, with a particular focus on the transmission of experience and the subjective value of contemporary witnessing. The same is true when we think about earlier examples of bottom-up history that were driven by new mnemotechnologies, such as the photographic camera, for example. As Elizabeth Edwards has shown in her masterful study, The Camera as Historian, the amateur photography movement in the late 19th century England fostered a new documentary impulse and produced a vast amount of mediated memories. The amateur, says Zizek Smolicki, seen as untrained witness of the non-eventness of the everyday, was problematized as a new agent entering the archive and as a potential source for rethinking historical imagination and representation. So, with the new development of, new mnemotechnologies, especially the integration of camera lenses into mobile phones around the start of the new millennium, a new digital capture culture has emerged, giving rise to an unprecedented boom of digital-born archives stored on private computers or online platforms. The rise of such new types of archives, especially the acknowledgement of forms of participatory and community archives that do not necessarily align with the Western institutional gaze, has broadened our understanding of what Popper has called the archival multiverse. And jointly with the digital turn, has really rewritten the semiotics of the archive. As such, archiving has been transformed due to the epistemic nature of mediality itself. Across the different technical and methodological approaches, as well as epistemological interests, the critical function of digital archives or living archives as acts of emergency preservation has become evident. Both the motivation for creating those archives and their scope have been traditionally quite diverse. Some of the first were reactions to the terrorist attacks in 9/11 and to natural catastrophes like the Hurricane Katrina. And both of these first, so-called living archives or memory banks have been at that time created and developed by the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, who were really one of the pioneering institutions in the field of digital history. Since the war in Syria, a new quality has been introduced in digital archiving. Since 2014, for example, NGOs such as Mnemonic systematically built archives that not only document ongoing political events, but specifically focus on documenting in such way that human rights violations can be prosecuted. Mnemonic has not only built an extensive online archive for the war in Syria and subsequent conflicts in Yemen and Sudan, but is now following a similar approach for Ukraine, and I would not be surprised if the same would be happening for Gaza. And they offer active support for getting what they call rapid response initiative off the ground. Since Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine, quite similar archiving efforts have been rapidly deployed, including Sucho, so Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online, an initiative that has web archived more than 5,000 websites and 50 terabytes of data already of Ukrainian cultural institutions to prevent those websites from going offline. The scope of activities is, however, even broader, as initiatives such as the Lviv Center for Urban History have spearheaded into archiving the relatively censor-resistant messenger service Telegram, or a broad variety of multimedia material ranging from photos and videos over oral history testimonies to dream diaries. We currently see similar initiatives here, of course, in Israel, with the Edut 710 testimonies database, the Mapping the Massacre Initiative database, or the Documentation and Deposit project of the National Library, or the Open University of Israel, and there are many more. Comparable initiatives on the Palestinian side are more scarce, yet the Palestinian Museum of Digital Archive and the interactive encyclopedia of the Palestine question will certainly be enriched by thematic collections covering the conflict soon. So despite the fact that we see numerous of such activities all around the world, with few notable exceptions, such as Malte Thiessen's history of the coronavirus pandemic, we have hardly any experience to systematically reflect the consequences of historians being put in the role of real-time archivists. The blurring of boundaries between historians and archivists, one could even add journalists, to the digital turn, intersects with essentially all activities in historical knowledge production. Every interaction, intervention, interrogation, and interpretation by creator, user, and archivist is an activation of the record. The archive is an infinite activation of the record. Each activation leaves fingerprints which are attributes to the archive's infinite meaning, says Eric Kettler. So in constructing living archives, in co-designing memory banks, digital archivists and historians are actively involved in the framing of potential tacit narratives that future users of such database histories will be able to perform. Or, in the words of Amalia Sabiescu, I quote, "At the core of living archives is the performative celebration of the past through contemporary acts of creation and transmission." So, how we capture, store, and enrich sources in the present defines the future archival performativity. So doing history in that sense forces us to reflect on the practical, epistemological, and ethical dimensions of databases and data models. From an epistemological point of view, data models essentially inform the way in which data are analyzed and interpreted. The historical method is, as you know, traditionally centered around the concept of provenance, relevant for both internal and external source criticism. Living archives very often face the challenge that their content is lacking explicit metadata or information pertaining to objects presented with a certain degree of vagueness and ambiguity. Real-time archiving in turn challenges its external source criticism due to the multiple transformations that data needs to go through in order to be archived and made searchable. This raises questions such as what archiving techniques produce rich enough metadata to support the task of source criticism in the future? And how can integrity, provenance, and traceability maintained at high level if multiple steps of data acquisition and transformation are involved? If data is gathered under condition of political, environmental, or social crisis, or even under the condition of war, additional layers of complexity arise. While participatory design encourages collaboration and contribution, it also raises questions such as whether or not to allow for anonymous contributions. On the one hand, the possibility to share data anonymously facilitates contributions, especially in situations where the risk of possible repercussions for participating in the documentation of, for example, military actions or war crimes is imminent. On the other hand, important information on the origin of the data is lost and traceability is limited or even impossible, not to mention the risk of falsification and the possibility of abuse by malicious actors. Given the event-related creation of living and real-time archives and the lack of time for critical appraisal and selection of content, questions arise of how the gathered data can or should be enriched, maybe ex post, to add contextual information. Here, community-based approaches to metadata generation and enrichment have proven highly effective and are currently employed by projects such as C²DH. Enrichment can take many forms, such as norming metadata, connecting the data to authority files, or registering collections of sources in finding aids such as library catalogs. In a project called LiveArc, documenting Russia's war against Ukraine, the challenges of living archives and for historical knowledge production, a project headed by the Herder Institute for Historical Research on East Central Europe in Marburg, in which we and the Roy Rosenzweig Center and some others collaborate, we aim at critically evaluating different types of sources, such as history, oral history interviews or chat archives, and to explore which kinds of supplementary information can be identified, acquired, and used for enriching records. A distinct challenge of living archives is aligning the rich, yet often subjective and diverse contextual information provided by the contributors with the requirement for standardized metadata by infrastructures and computational techniques. So how can this transformation to be recorded, extracted, normed, and incorporated in metadata using authority files or other external resources? How can we improve the data according to fair curation? What are the limits of fairness in the context of the duty to protect and care? So, living and real-time archives as forms of emergency archiving also raise questions regarding data governance and data ownership. First, they clearly have a procedural dimension. For newly created archives face questions such as who will provide the infrastructure? How can long-term availability, especially of smaller or ad hoc collections, be ensured? How to guarantee participation of all communities affected? How to handle access in transnational collaborative settings? Second, given the often sensitive content, documenting violence, destruction, or trauma, a complex bundle of contradictory requirements, interests, and incentives emerges, challenging those who need to make decisions regarding ethical questions. Archival projects thus have a duty to care for project staff, helpers, and all kinds of contributors as well as users. Creating and handling data documenting a war is likely to be traumatizing, even more so for people with little or no experience or professional training in dealing with this kinds of evidence. So doing so in an ethical, responsible, sensitive, and informed way, while fostering the resilience of those involved, is a key issue. The same holds true for the manifold voices recorded in the archive, whose interests might need to be taken into account, especially if an active consent cannot be obtained. Given the event-related creation of often grassroots nature, only 5 minutes, yeah, I have to hurry, sorry. I lost. Given the event-related creation and often grassroots nature of living archives, admission policies for material are unlikely to exist or impossible to enforce. Hence, means such as anonymization, access restrictions, and flagging critical material out are conspicuous solutions. Well, I'll skip over then one example I wanted to explain a little bit. So what kind of models for using fair data management and we are actually experimenting with, and to see places where, for example, emergency archiving has been institutionalized. And I was recently at a conference in Kobe in Japan, where they presented a task force that has been created in Japan to deal with disaster events, and how then sending task forces of public historians to such places in order to build community archiving projects to rescue that cultural heritage. And I think this is a really interesting examples of how one can think about this also from an institutional perspective. Yeah, and I'll go over some technical standards we actually experiment with. As we have seen, doing real-time archiving as a mode for capturing historical evidence in a digital environment comes with many challenges, be it technical, practical, or epistemological. But is there such thing as real-time history? Isn't the very nature of any historiographical exercise to work with a modus of critical or in a modus of critical distance that operates on the temporal difference between source and interpretation? What if this distance shrinks to the chronotopos of the extended now, discussed earlier? Can we, under such conditions, really speak about doing history? Or are historians involved in rapid response archiving projects reduced to activists or civilian figures in a communicative memory practice? In archives, our memory objects exist in a status of latency, in between a no longer and not yet. They pause, so to speak, in the waiting room of history. Do we as public historians, when operating in the future, in the modus of future perfect, as Achim Landwehr was saying, really safeguard documentary evidence for future historical research? Or are we rather involved in what Aleida Assmann calls custodial forgetting? We store thousands of digital photos, videos, and emails on our smartphones, laptops, or clouds, in the naive hope of retrieving them again someday. Does the age of abundance, as Roy Rosenzweig has called it, come to the cost of digital oblivion? The question of digital forgetting is even more relevant for the leading medium of our digital age, the internet, but I will not go into this topic neither. This is really the field of expertise of Anat, and maybe she will be talking about it a little later. So the practices of digital history have long been affected, as we know, by media, new media technologies. But the impact on those technologies, on key concepts and basic assumptions of the field, I think have largely been unexplored. As public or digital historians, we aim to co-produce and sharing historical knowledge with our audiences, but I think we need a more systematic reflection about how this vision of shared authority is affected by the nature of the digital as new ecosystem of historical practice. If we acknowledge the fact that the gap between the raw and the cooked in digital public history remains substantial, as suggested by Michael Frisch, we need to investigate how historians and their publics, in mutual interaction and codependency, gather, collect, consume, disseminate, and engage with history and its sources. So taking into account the plurality of publics that digital public history has to deal with, sharing authority between professional historians and those publics asks for a systematic reflection on when, how, and where those publics are involved in the co-production of historical knowledge. Involving people in a mediated process of crowdsourcing or organizing history harvests with the local communities not necessarily involves a real sharing of authority when it comes to the managing, curating, and long-term accessibility of and preservation of these sources. The crowd rarely participates in the design or architecture of databases or the definition of metadata standards that ultimately define the limits and possibilities and findability of information in a structured database. If the codes of web-based public history applications are not made available or shared on open source platforms, for example, digital public history projects are susceptible of reinforcing knowledge asymmetries between historians, engaged participants, and technical collaborators such as coders, programmers, web designers, or data stewards. My time is over, I'm told. So let me just finish with the last paragraph. I wanted to say something more about especially the ethical dimension and the duty for care that is really important in that field, but yeah, I was speaking too long. If digital public historians, as outlined by Ed Ayers, are to take our discipline out to the world, then we will have to do so by embracing the idea of a polychronic present, and that historians of the present have to be multi-vocal. Collecting should be done in partnership with local communities rather than simply assuming collecting will occur due to the historical importance of an event. Multiple forms and formats of interaction with locals should be explored to include hidden minority experiences and produce multivocal representation and narrative. In addition to uploaded memories and social media platforms, digital public historians therefore need to engage really with local communities in order to compensate for the silences in living archives and to reduce algorithmic or code biases written into the architecture and design of relational databases. So only when being aware of the fact that turning a database or digital archive into meaningful storytelling is a balancing act between the back end and the front end, between the hidden architecture, design, ontologies, and metadata vocabularies of content management systems, websites, or databases, and what's visible on the screen, we can really engage with the tacit narratives that are written into such databases. The democratic potential of such histories has always been read against the disciplining power of database designs. Otherwise, we are susceptible of reinforcing knowledge asymmetries instead of producing new and hopefully more integrative and multivocal narratives of the past. Thank you very much.
So we have a short time for a few questions. Please.
The question is about regulatory measures for these digital archiving or standardization. The concern is, of course, abuse or what they used to call fake realities.
Yes.
And the question is, without such agreed regulatory bodies or standardizations, anything can be interpreted in whichever way. So were any such efforts? Like engineering software is always, it exists for many years now. Question is what's happening in this field?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. That was one of the parts I skipped when I wanted to present some of the standards that are around, both on the technical side from IEEE, for example, but also from the more ethical side. And here the International Association for Public History, for example, EFPH, they have published guidelines, and so there are standards and regulations around. But when you look at the different initiatives, you see that very often people, because of the emergency situation, start just documenting, collecting, building an archive without having thought about this in advance. And that very often causes huge problems because it's really hard to engineer this when you have started doing so. So that's why I really like this initiative in Japan, where they say it's very likely that other catastrophes will happen, and be it natural disasters or political or whatever. So I really like that idea of having kind of task force institutionalized that can also from a governmental or state perspective, or be it at university level, act as a guiding help in such events. But it's they are around, as very often knowledge is around, but many people aren't aware of it, and so we have to balance that situation.
Thank you very much.